Okay, let's talk about insomnia post-menopause. And we're going to be talking about that because one of our members in the Facebook group said that they basically have been dealing with this exacerbation of her insomnia after menopause, alongside these sort of strange neurological sensations. She has low COMT as well. So we're going to be talking about what is it about menopause that tends to very characteristically, almost indelibly, produce insomnia, and therefore what can we do about that, and how does that overlap with slow COMT? That latter part I'm going to talk about later in another video. Let's talk about just one aspect of the post-menopause insomnia picture. So with insomnia, what happens? With insomnia, you get a huge decline in progesterone levels. So progesterone is an important hormone, as you all know, and when progesterone goes down, you get less of the neurological effects of progesterone. What are those neurological effects? Progesterone is a GABA agonist, meaning it acts on GABA receptors to do the same thing essentially that GABA does. What does GABA do? GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It's involved in restoring the brain, essentially. It's sort of the converse to glutamate. So when you have too much glutamate, you have this hyperexcitatory picture, which can evolve as anxiety, migraines, light sensitivity, basically sort of the Chinese food syndrome, so-called Chinese food syndrome, where after eating a bunch of MSG at a fast food, American Chinese restaurant, you get this headache, this vague headache, and you just feel bad neurologically. That's because of excess glutamate, which is what MSG is, monosodium glutamate. GABA is the opposite of that. So GABA is going to produce an inhibitory picture. When you get less progesterone, you get less activation of GABA receptors, and you get less of that inhibition. And that GABA inhibition is essential for the onset of sleep and overall architecture, you could say, of sleep, the overall structure of sleep. That is so. Is that a problem for everyone? That's going to be some degree of a change for everyone for sure, but it's going to be especially a problem for those people who have pre-existing GABA problems, pre-existing low GABA, or problems with the GABA receptors. So our goal is to fix those pre-existing problems so the progesterone issue becomes a non-issue or nearly a non-issue. What would I do in this case? What I would do is ideally test your GAD status. GAD is a specific enzyme encoded by a gene that turns glutamate into GABA. So you can already see, obviously, how that would be very relevant. If this enzyme is converting glutamate to GABA, if it's functioning well, you're not going to get too much glutamate and you're going to get enough GABA. If it's functioning not well, you're not going to get enough GABA and you're going to have too much glutamate. So if you have genetic deficits in GAD, like this, for example, so there's two main RSIDs. RSID means a specific spot on the DNA, a locus on the DNA. So there's two main RSIDs that we tend to look at for GAD. This one, there's a homozygous deficit in one of those, which tends to be significant. It tends to have some degree of an effect. So that's going to lead to a little bit of a genetic predisposition to more glutamate and less GABA, so not making enough GABA. So if you have a genetic deficit like this, you're going to be more prone to the sleep problems that occur post-menopause due to less progesterone specifically. If you have a genetic deficit like this, and especially, so let's say you did something like this and you had two homozygous deficits, or these are both red, that's a very significant deficit, and that definitely means you need to do something to deal with your GAD deficits. If you have a GAD deficit, what do? You need to address those things upon which GAD relies to do its function. Most specifically, vitamin B6. So B6 in its active form is the cofactor for GAD. So you have to assess your B6 status. That's a tall order because assessing B6 status is not as simple as just getting a plasma B6. Plasma B6 is usually normal even when you have an actual need for more B6. So, it can be useful in those cases to get an in-depth organic acid test that gives you metabolites of those pathways that are dependent on B6, specifically things like kynurenine and xanthurenate, and things like that. You need to assess plasma zinc. Low plasma zinc tends to lead to less, number one, activation, and number 2, intracellular translocation of vitamin B6. So that's an issue. So you have to assess B6, you have to assess zinc, and you can, even if you don't have these deficits, you still need to assess those things. It just becomes way more important to assess those things if you have these deficits. You can also do those things that will essentially kind of mimic GABA. Of course, you can just take GABA. You can take GABA as a supplement before bed. That works for a lot of people. For some people, it tends to backfire. But if you get GABA, it's usually a few hundred milligrams. Obviously, none of this is a recommendation to you. I'm not your doctor. This is all education. You can also do theanine. Theanine is a GABAergic substance, L-theanine. I tend to like the sun-theanine form, sun like the sun in the sky, and usually do around 200 to 300 milligrams before bed. But when you do theanine, I tend to recommend doing it 5 days on and 2 days off, or 4-3, something like that, to reduce the likelihood of developing a little bit of a tolerance to it. So you can do like the weekdays and then not do it on the weekends. So that can be good postmenopausally due to the drop in the GABAergic effects of progesterone and that effect on sleep. You also need to absolutely make sure you're not having excess glutamate ingestion. So avoid MSG, avoid soy sauce, avoid liquid aminos, avoid coconut aminos, and so on, especially obviously before bed. But generally, just throughout the day, you want to avoid that stuff. Even glutamine supplements, that's not something you're going to want to do because that can increase glutamate too. You might not be taking an isolated glutamine supplement, but you need to look at any digestive support supplements that you're taking because those often have some glutamine in them. So look at that too. What else do you need to do? You should make sure you don't have sulfur overload. Again, we're talking about postmenopausal insomnia due to the progesterone side of the picture, leading to less GABAergic effects. Another thing you need to do, like I said, is to look into sulfur overload. If you have sulfur overload, that's going to lead to more sulfocysteine, which has glutaminergic effects. So that's going to be a problem too. So you should look into that. That can also be assessed somewhat to some degree by a good organic acid test. That's a reasonable place to start. And we're going to talk about the other elements of the picture and how slow COMT plays into that picture with regards to, again, postmenopausal insomnia. So I hope this helps. And please, put any questions or comments you have below this video.